What forces a lone, heavily pregnant woman to stare down the barrels of a slave trader's rifle? It wasn't just courage. It was an echo of a life she couldn't remember. When Maria risked everything for a broken cowboy and his two small children chained in a dusty caravan, she thought she was just doing what was right. She never imagined that in the face of this desperate stranger, she was staring at her own forgotten past, a past that held the key to his broken heart and the truth of the baby growing inside her. This isn't just a tale of the West. It's a story of a love so strong, not even memory's death could bury it. The sun over the Chihuahuan desert was a merciless god hammering the cracked earth with a fist of white-hot light. From the meager shade of a rocky overhang, the woman known as Maria watched the heat shimmer rise from the valley floor, distorting the distant mesas into wobbling apparitions. She had been in this small, isolated cabin for nearly a year, ever since a kindly, childless widow named Martha had found her wandering delirious near the Rio Grande, her memory a scorched and empty landscape. Martha was gone, now laid to rest under a stubborn mesquite tree, leaving Maria with the cabin, a handful of skills, and a life that felt borrowed. And a child, her own child, growing steadily beneath her heart. She would press a hand against the tight swell of her belly, a gesture of both wonder and a profound, aching loneliness. The child was a miracle, a reason to endure the solitude, but also a mystery. She had no memory of its father, no name to whisper into the lonely dark. There was only the before and the after. Before was a black, silent void. After was this harsh, beautiful land, and the life kicking within her. It was the glint of metal that first caught her eye. Not the natural shimmer of mica in the rock, but the deliberate, ugly gleam of a rifle barrel. She flattened herself against the warm stone, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Down on the old, barely there trail that snaked through the valley, a grim procession moved. A single heavy wagon, its canvas stained with sweat and grime, pulled by 4 exhausted mules. 2 men on horseback flanked it, their figures wavering in the heat. It was the cargo that made her blood run cold. Chained to the back of the wagon, stumbling to keep pace, was a man. His head was bowed, a straw hat doing little to shield his sun-scalded face. His clothes were rags, his wrists and ankles raw from the iron cuffs. But it was the 2 small figures trudging beside him that shattered the last of Maria's composure. A boy and a girl, no older than 5 or 6, tethered to the man by a shorter, cruel-looking chain. Their small legs struggled to match the wagon's lurching pace. Slave traders, the lowest form of predator, to crawl the forsaken lands of the West. Men like Bartholomew Bart Finch, whose reputation for cruelty was a foul whisper carried on the desert wind. He dealt in human misery, capturing indebted families or lone travelers, and selling them to illegal mining operations or desolate ranchos where they would be worked to death. Maria had heard Martha speak of him in hushed, fearful tones. Fear, coiled in her gut, cold and sharp. She should stay hidden. She was one woman heavy with child against armed men. To interfere was suicide. She had a life to protect the one inside her. But as she watched the little girl stumble and fall, only to be yanked harshly back to her feet by the chain, a fire erupted in Maria's chest. A rage so potent, it burned away the fear. It was an instinct primal and absolute. Protect the children. She didn't have a plan, not a real one. Just a desperate, tumbling collection of thoughts. Martha's late husband had been a prospector, and he'd left behind more than just the cabin. In a dusty crate under the floorboards were several sticks of dynamite. He'd used them for blasting rock, but Maria suddenly saw a different purpose. For the next hour, she worked with a speed and focus that surprised her. Her hands, usually gentle, as she tended her small garden, were now deft and sure as she handled the dangerous explosives. She knew this part of the valley intimately, the way the rocks were balanced, the places where the earth was loose. She found a narrow pass ahead of the caravan's route, a place where a rock slide would be both plausible and effective. She wedged the dynamite into the deep crevices of the cliff face, her breath held tight in her chest. She laid the long fuse, shielding it from the wind, her mind a blank slate of pure, unadulterated purpose. She scrambled to a higher vantage point, Martha's old Winchester rifle clutched in her hands. It was heavy, unfamiliar, but she'd watched Martha's husband clean it enough times to know its basic workings. From here, she could see the caravan crawling toward the trap. The two outriders were lazy in the heat, their attention drifting. As the wagon entered the narrowest point of the pass, Maria touched the lit match to the end of the fuse. It sparked, hissed, and disappeared into the rock like a fiery snake. She held her breath, counting the seconds. The explosion was a deafening roar that ripped through the valley's silence. It wasn't a massive Hollywood-style blast, but a deep, gut-wrenching concussion. Rock and earth split apart, and a torrent of boulders and scree cascaded down onto the trail, completely blocking the path directly in front of the lead mules. The animals screamed and reared their eyes wide with terror. The wagon lurched to a halt, its front wheels splintering against the new wall of rock. Chaos erupted. One of the outriders, a lanky man with a pockmarked face, was thrown from his spooked horse. The other, a heavy-set man with a greasy beard, fought to control his mount while yelling curses into the dust-filled air. This was her chance. Maria sighted down the Winchester's barrel. She wasn't aiming to kill, not yet. She aimed for the ground just in front of the bearded man's horse. The shot cracked, and a puff of dust erupted at the horse's feet. It shrieked, bucking wildly, and unseated its rider with a thud. "Drop your guns!" Maria's voice, raw and amplified by the canyon walls, sounded stronger than she felt. "Leave the wagon and ride out, or the next one goes through your skull." The pockmarked man, scrambling to his feet, fumbled for his pistol. The bearded one, groaning on the ground, was trying to do the same. They couldn't see her, a ghost in the rocks above. It was the perfect confusion. She fired again, this time splintering the wood of the wagon's buckboard inches from the driver's head. He shrieked and threw his hands up, abandoning the reins. "I have enough dynamite to bury this whole pass," she bluffed, her voice shaking only slightly. "Your lives or the cargo. Decide now, panic one." The two outriders, seeing their horses bolting and believing a whole gang was hidden in the rocks, chose their lives. The pockmarked man scrambled onto his recovered horse and galloped away without a backward glance. The bearded man, clutching his arm, managed to limp after him, disappearing into the swirling dust. The driver, a skinny youth, simply leaped from his seat and ran, his feet pounding a frantic rhythm of retreat. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the whimpering of the mules and the soft crying of the children. Maria waited, her rifle still raised, her body trembling from the adrenaline. Minutes stretched into an eternity. When she was certain they were gone, she carefully made her way down the treacherous slope. As she got closer, the man chained to the wagon slowly lifted his head. His face was a mask of dirt and dried blood, but his eyes were a startling, piercing blue, and they were fixed on her with an expression of dazed disbelief. He looked at her pregnant form, then at the rifle in her hands, as if trying to reconcile the two realities. "Ah, are they gone?" he rasped, his voice cracked from thirst. "They're gone," Maria confirmed, her own voice barely a whisper. She kept the rifle ready, still wary. The little girl, her face streaked with tears and dust, looked up at Maria with wide, terrified eyes. The boy stood protectively in front of his sister, his small body rigid with fear. Maria's gaze softened. The rage that had fueled her was replaced by a wave of overwhelming compassion. She walked to the back of the wagon and looked for the keys to the locks. They were hanging from a hook on the wagon's side. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the rusted iron. The first lock on the man's wrists sprang open. He slumped against the tailgate, rubbing his raw skin. Then she knelt, her movements awkward with her belly, and unlocked the cuffs on the children's ankles. Finally, she freed the man's legs. He didn't stand, his strength utterly spent. "Thank you," he breathed, the words barely audible. He reached out, not for her, but for his children, pulling them into a fierce, protective embrace. He buried his face in their hair, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Maria stood back, giving them the moment. She looked at the trio, huddled together, a broken father and his traumatized children. She had saved them, but as the adrenaline faded, a new, more daunting reality set in. She was now responsible for them. 3 more mouths to feed, 3 more lives to protect, in a world that had shown them its ugliest face. And the men who had done this would not simply forget. They would be back, looking at the cowboy's striking blue eyes, a flicker of something like a half-remembered dream on the edge of waking, sparked in the darkness of her mind, and was gone, just as quickly, leaving only a faint, unsettling echo. The journey back to the cabin was a slow, arduous procession. Maria led one of the mules, its back loaded with what few provisions she could salvage from the trader's wagon: a sack of flour, a barrel of water, some dried beans. The cowboy, whose name she learned was Caleb Thorne, leaned heavily on the other mule. He was weak, his body a canvas of bruises and cuts, but his focus never strayed from his children Samuel and Rose, who walked beside him, their small hands clutching his tattered trousers. The cabin, once a symbol of Maria's isolation, now felt like a sanctuary. It was small, just a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a bed in the corner, but it was safe. As they entered, the children's eyes grew wide, taking in the simple domesticity: a pot of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, a colorful patched quilt on the bed, as if they were seeing wonders from a forgotten world. The first hours were a blur of quiet, necessary tasks. Maria moved with an efficiency that belied her condition. She heated water over the fire, her hands gentle as she cleaned the grime and blood from Caleb's face and the children's tear-streaked cheeks. The cuts on his wrists were deep and infected. She cleaned them with a sharp-smelling poultice of yarrow and crushed leaves, a remedy Martha had taught her. Caleb flinched, but didn't complain, his gaze following her every move, with a mixture of gratitude and profound weariness. "They call me Caleb," he said, finally, his voice still hoarse. "My children? Samuel and Rose? I'm Maria," she replied softly, her focus on bandaging his wrists with clean strips of cloth. She gave the children a warm, diluted broth, and they drank it greedily. They hadn't spoken a single word since the rescue. They moved as one unit, their small bodies always touching, finding solace in each other's presence. When she laid them down on a pallet of blankets near the hearth, they curled into each other, their breathing slowly evening out into the deep rhythm of exhausted sleep. With the children settled, a heavy silence fell between the two adults. Caleb sat at the small table, his bandaged hands resting on the wood. He stared into the fire, the flames dancing in his haunted blue eyes. "They took everything," he murmured, his voice thick with a grief that felt ancient. "Our wagon, our horses, my wife." Maria's hands stilled. "Your wife?" He nodded, his throat working. Her name was Lillian. We were headed for California. A new start. We had a small ranch back in Texas, but a fever took our stock. We sold the land and packed what we had left. He paused, the memory too sharp, too painful. We were ambushed. Not far from here, maybe a month ago. It was Finch's men. They left me for dead and took the children. I don't know what happened to Lillian. She was gone when I came to. He looked at Maria, then his eyes pleading, as if she might hold the answers to his shattered world. "She's out there somewhere. I have to believe that. I was trying to track them to get my children back, but I was weak. They caught me." The story hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Maria felt a pang of something sharp and unfamiliar in her chest. It was a phantom pain, an echo of his loss, that resonated within her own empty past. "I'm so sorry, Caleb," she whispered. He just shook his head, a gesture of utter despair. Later, as a sliver of moon rose over the dark mesas, Maria offered him her bed. "You need rest, real rest. I can sleep by the fire near the children." He refused. "I couldn't. Not in your condition." His gaze dropped to her swollen belly, and a flicker of a new emotion crossed his face. Not pity, but a kind of gentle, sorrowful respect. "I'll take the floor. I've slept on worse." There was no arguing with the quiet finality in his voice. She gave him a blanket, and he settled near the door, a silent guardian, watching over his sleeping children. Maria lay on her pallet, the warmth of the fire a small comfort. She could hear Caleb's soft, uneven breathing, the sound of a man wrestling with nightmares, even in his waking hours. She thought of his wife Lillian, a woman with a name, a history, a woman who was loved and desperately missed. Maria had none of those things. She was a blank page, a ghost, inhabiting someone else's life. Lying there in the dark, she felt an inexplicable connection to this stranger and his children. It was more than just the shared trauma of the day. It was something deeper, a current running beneath the surface of her conscious thought. The way Caleb had described the ambush a month ago, not far from here. The timing aligned with her own fragmented arrival in the valley. A head injury, Martha had said, delirious and lost. Could there be a connection? The thought was a wild, desperate leap in the dark, and she dismissed it as the fantasy of a lonely woman. Days bled into a week. A fragile routine formed within the cabin walls. Caleb, regaining his strength, proved to be a capable man. He chopped wood with a steady rhythmic swing of the axe. He repaired the broken fence around Maria's small garden, his hands surprisingly skilled. He spoke little, but his actions were his language, a language of gratitude and a deep-seated need to contribute to pull his own weight. The children, Samuel and Rose, began to thaw. Rose, with her father's blue eyes and a spray of freckles across her nose, was the first to speak. She approached Maria one afternoon as she was kneading dough, her small voice a hesitant whisper. "Is that for bread?" Maria smiled, a genuine, unforced smile. "It is. Would you like to help?" Rose nodded, and soon both she and Samuel were there, their small hands dusted with flour, their faces alight with a childlike curiosity that had been brutally suppressed. They began to follow Maria around the cabin, watching her with an intensity that was both endearing and heartbreaking. They were like two small, resilient flowers turning toward the first sign of sun after a long, hard frost. One evening, as Maria was humming a simple, nameless tune while mending one of Samuel's torn shirts, she noticed Caleb watching her. He was sitting across the room, cleaning the Winchester with a focused intensity, but his hands had stilled. There was a strange, searching look on his face. "That song," he said, his voice quiet. "Where did you learn it?" Maria paused, the needle hovering in her fingers. She searched her mind. The tune was just there. It had been with her as long as she could remember being Maria. "I don't know," she confessed, a familiar frustration welling up. "It's just a tune, I know." Caleb's expression was unreadable. He looked down at the rifle in his hands, then back at her. "Lillian, my wife, she used to hum that to the children." The words hung in the air between them, charged and heavy. Maria's heart gave a painful lurch. Coincidence. It had to be a coincidence. A simple folk tune, perhaps one that many people knew. But the look in Caleb's eyes held no room for coincidence. It was a look of dawning, terrifying, impossible hope. He was seeing more than just Maria, the woman who had saved him. He was searching for a ghost. And for the first time, Maria was terrified that he might actually find one inside her. She looked away, her gaze falling on the children sleeping peacefully by the fire. A fierce, protective instinct, the same one that had driven her to blow up the trail, surged through her. She was their rescuer, their protector. That was her role. She couldn't be a mirage, a cruel trick of hope for a man who had already lost everything. The melody died on her lips, and she resolved to never hum it again. The passing weeks wove a strange tapestry of domesticity within the isolated cabin. The four of them became a family, forged in crisis, their bonds strengthening with each shared meal, each sunset, watched from the cabin's porch. Caleb's physical wounds healed the raw flesh on his wrists, turning to pale scars. He moved with a renewed purpose, his lean frame filling out the haunted look in his eyes, receding, replaced by a quiet watchfulness. He and Maria worked in a silent, intuitive partnership. He'd bring in firewood and water. She'd turn it into a warm hearth and a nourishing meal. They were two halves of a whole, surviving against the odds. The children were the heart of their fragile world. Samuel, quiet and observant, began to shadow Caleb, mimicking the way he swung the axe or checked the horizon. Rose, meanwhile, became Maria's little helper. She'd chatter away as they weeded the garden or ground corn, her questions a constant stream of innocent curiosity. "Maria, why is the sky blue? Maria, do you think Mama is a star now?" Each mention of their mother was a small, sharp pain in Caleb's heart, a pain Maria could see reflected in the sudden tension in his jaw. It was also a pain that resonated strangely within her. She felt an overwhelming urge to comfort the girl, to say something that would soothe her, but the words always caught in her throat. What could a woman with no past say to a child grieving for hers? The outside world remained a distant threat, a low rumble of thunder on the far horizon. But one day, the thunder rolled closer. Caleb had taken the mule into the small, dusty settlement of Tres Piedras, a good half-day's ride away, to trade some pelts for salt, sugar, and other necessities they couldn't grow or make. It was a risk, but a necessary one. He returned late, his face grim, the usual quietness about him replaced by a tense, simmering anger. He waited until the children were asleep before he spoke. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and unfolded it on the table. It was a wanted poster, the ink stark against the cheap paper. The sketch was crude, but the man's features were undeniably Caleb's. Wanted Caleb Thorne, for horse theft and outstanding debts to Mr. Bartholomew Finch. $200 reward, dead or alive. Finch, Caleb, said the name a curse on his lips. He's not just a slaver. He's a vulture. He buys up debts, forecloses on land. He's the one who held the note on my Texas ranch. He engineered the whole thing. The fever that killed my stock wasn't natural. I'm sure of it now. He wanted my land, but when I sold it before he could foreclose, he felt cheated. He tapped the poster. This isn't about debt. This is about silencing me. He can't have me telling the law what he's doing, who he is. Maria stared at the poster, at the cold, final words. Dead or alive. The sanctuary of their cabin suddenly felt terribly fragile, its walls as thin as paper. Finch wasn't just a distant evil, he was actively hunting them. He'll have men everywhere. Caleb continued, his voice low. Bounty hunters. Desperate men who'd sell their own mothers for $200. We're not safe here anymore, Maria. Fear, cold and familiar, washed over her. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just for herself or her unborn child. It was for this man and the two sleeping children who had become the center of her universe. What do? We have to leave, he said, his jaw set. Head further west, into Arizona territory. Get lost in the mountains. We can't do it right away. You're too close to your time, and the children aren't strong enough for a hard journey. But soon, we have to be ready to run at a moment's notice. The news settled over the cabin like a shroud. The gentle rhythm of their lives was broken. Now, every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching rider. Caleb began to sleep in shifts, taking the rifle with him to a high point overlooking the valley for hours at a time, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Amid this rising tension, the strange moments of connection, the flickers of a shared past grew more frequent and more unsettling. One afternoon, Maria was trying to fix the cabin's leaky roof, a task she'd been putting off. She struggled with a heavy hammer, her movements made clumsy by her belly. Caleb came over, took the hammer from her hand, and with a few swift, expertly placed blows, secured the loose shingles. He handed the hammer back to her, and as her fingers brushed against his, a jolt went through her. It wasn't a spark of attraction, but a shock of pure, unadulterated memory. A flash of a memory so vivid it stole her breath. Sunlight filtering through the framework of an unfinished house. The smell of fresh-sawn pine. The solid, comforting weight of this exact hammer in her hand. A man's voice, warm and laughing, behind her. "No, no, Lilly-bug, not like that. You'll split the wood. Let me show you." Maria gasped, dropping the hammer with a clatter. Her hand flew to her head, a dizzying wave of vertigo washing over her. Maria Caleb was at her side, instantly, his hands on her arms, steadying her. "What is it? Are you all right? Is it the baby Lilly-bug?" She whispered the name, feeling foreign and yet intimately familiar on her tongue. She looked at him, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. Someone called me that." Caleb froze. Every trace of color drained from his face. His hands on her arms tightened, his knuckles white. He stared at her, not as Maria, but as if he was seeing a spectre in the broad daylight. "What did you say?" He breathed, his voice barely audible. "Lilly-bug," she repeated, her own voice trembling. I don't know where that came from." It was his name for her, his private loving nickname for Lillian. He had never spoken it aloud in this cabin. He had never said it to anyone since the day he lost her. For him, it was a sacred word, a relic of a life that was gone. And she had just spoken it. He took a step back, his expression a chaotic mix of awe, terror, and a hope so fierce it was agonizing. He looked at her face, searching, pleading. He saw the same dark hair, the same curve of her jaw, the same determined set to her chin. But her eyes, Lillian's eyes, had been a soft, gentle hazel. Maria's were a deep, guarded brown. And they were filled with a confusion that mirrored his own. "Maria," he began, his voice cracking. He reached out as if to touch her face, but let his hand fall. "The lullaby. The hammer. Now this, it can't be. I don't understand," she pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. The flashes of memory were like lightning strikes in a dark room, illuminating everything for a terrifying second before plunging her back into darkness, more disoriented than before. "Caleb, what's happening to me?" He didn't answer. He turned and walked to the small wooden chest where they kept their few precious belongings. He knelt and pulled out a small leather-bound pouch. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a single object, a small silver locket, tarnished and dented. He walked back to her and held it out. "This was hers," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Lillian's. Her mother gave it to her. She never ever took it off." Maria stared at the locket. It was simple, unadorned, except for a small, unique pattern of engraved vines around the edge. Her hand, moving with a will of its own, rose to her own neck, to the hollow of her throat. There was nothing there, but she could almost feel the phantom weight of it, the cool metal against her skin. He gently opened the locket. On one side was a miniature portrait, a faded, lovingly painted image of a young man, with startlingly blue eyes and a hopeful smile. It was a younger, happier Caleb. On the other side was a tiny, intricate portrait of a woman. She had dark hair, a gentle smile, and soft, hazel eyes. It was the face of a stranger. And yet, as Maria stared at it, a wave of nausea and grief so powerful it buckled her knees, washed over her. She saw the face in the locket, and for a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, she felt like she was looking in a mirror and seeing someone else's reflection. The world tilted on its axis, the solid ground beneath her feet giving way to a terrifying, bottomless abyss. The silver locket lay in Caleb's palm, a cold, heavy truth between them. Maria stared at the face of the woman inside the woman named Lillian and felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if her very soul was being pulled in two. The face was not her face. The hazel eyes were not her deep brown eyes. And yet looking at it felt like a betrayal, a denial of something fundamental that churned just beneath the surface of her shattered memory. "It's not me," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. She backed away from the locket as if it were a venomous snake, her hand pressed against her racing heart. "Caleb, I'm not her." But the certainty in her voice was a lie, a desperate defense against the impossible truth that was clawing at the edges of her mind. The lullaby, the nickname, the instinctive knowledge of how he took his coffee, a detail she'd known without ever being told. The pieces were all there, a constellation of facts whose shape she was terrified to acknowledge. Caleb's hope, which had flared so brightly, guttered and died, replaced by a weary confusion. He snapped the locket shut, the click echoing the closing of a door in his own heart. "I know," he said, his voice flat. "I'm sorry, I just—" For a moment, he couldn't finish the sentence. He looked at her, at the genuine fear and confusion in her eyes, and felt a surge of guilt. He was chasing a ghost and tormenting a living woman in the process, a woman who had saved him and his children. "I'm tired," she said, abruptly turning away. "I need to rest." It was a retreat, a flight from a conversation that threatened to unravel her sanity. The days that followed were thick with unspoken tension. They moved around each other with a careful, painful courtesy. The easy partnership was gone, replaced by a hyper-awareness of each other's presence. Caleb stopped watching her with that searching gaze, and Maria consciously avoided anything that might trigger another one of the terrifying memory flashes. She pushed the name Lilly-bug deep into the recesses of her mind, treating it like a dangerous secret. But the past, once disturbed, does not easily go back to sleep. The trigger came from the most innocent of sources, a child's love for a story. One evening, as a storm raged outside, rattling the cabin's shutters, little Rose was inconsolable. The thunder frightened her, and she cried for her mother. Caleb held her, murmuring soothing words, but his own grief made his comfort hollow. Maria, her heart aching for the child, went to her. "Hush now, little one," she said softly, stroking Rose's hair. "Let me tell you a story. A story about a brave little jackrabbit with mismatched ears." She began to speak, the tale spinning from her lips without conscious thought. It was a whimsical story about a rabbit who was teased by the others for his one floppy ear and one straight ear, but who used his unique hearing to save his burrow from a hungry coyote. As she spoke, she used funny voices, her hands creating shadow puppets against the fire-lit wall. Rose's sobs subsided, replaced by giggles. Samuel, who had been watching with wide eyes, crept closer. Even Caleb, who had been staring into the fire, lost in his own bleak thoughts, turned to listen. He watched her, and the guarded expression on his face slowly melted away, replaced by one of absolute stunned recognition. It wasn't just the story. It was the specific words, the unique character names: Barnaby, the rabbit; Old Man, Fitzwilliam, the coyote. It was a story Lillian had invented, a special tale she told only to Samuel and Rose on stormy nights. There was no way anyone else could know it. The dam of his denial broke. This went beyond coincidence. It was an impossibility. It was a miracle. When the story ended and the children, soothed and happy, were drifting to sleep, Caleb looked at Maria, his blue eyes blazing with an intensity that made her shrink back. "That story," he said, his voice trembling with a tightly controlled storm of emotion. "That was Lillian's story." "I don't know how I know it," she began, the old, tired excuse already on her lips. "Stop," he commanded, his voice gentle but firm. "Please, just stop." He crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt before her, taking her hands in his. They were cold as ice. "Maria, look at me." She forced herself to meet his gaze. "The raid," he said, his voice low and urgent, "when Finch's men attacked us, you were thrown from the wagon. You hit your head on a rock. There was so much blood. I thought you were dead. When I came to, you were gone. I searched, but I couldn't find you. I thought the animals, or that Finch had taken you too." His words were painting a picture, and with each stroke, a corresponding image flashed in her mind, blurry and distorted. But there, the sickening lurch of the wagon, a man's cruel laugh, the sharp, blinding pain at the side of her head. Your eyes, he continued, his voice cracking. Lillian's eyes were hazel. When Martha found you, she must have told you they were brown. It was the injury. Dr. Blackwood in Tres Piedras told me once about a patient whose eye color changed after a severe head trauma. A bleeding in the iris, he called it. It's rare, but it happens. He was pleading with her, offering her a bridge across the chasm of her lost memory. He reached into his pocket and pulled out not the locket, but a small folded piece of paper. It was a marriage certificate, worn and creased. He unfolded it. Caleb Thorne and Lillian Devereaux. The names swam before her eyes. Lillian, he whispered, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. You have a scar. A small, crescent-shaped one on your left wrist. You got it when you were a girl, climbing a pecan tree. Slowly, as if in a trance, Maria pulled back the sleeve of her dress. And there it was, faint, silvery white against her skin, but unmistakably there, a tiny, perfect crescent moon. She had seen it 1,000 times, a meaningless mark that had simply always been a part of her. Now, it was a brand, a signpost, to a life she couldn't remember. The room began to spin. The story of the jackrabbit, the lullaby, the way she knew how to use the hammer, the phantom weight of the locket at her throat, the scar. It was too much. A tidal wave of fragmented images, sounds, and sensations crashed over her. A field of bluebonnets. Caleb's laughter as he chased her. The feel of a small, warm hand in hers. Samuel's hand. The first flutter of life in her womb, and Caleb pressing his ear to her belly to listen. The terror on his face during the raid. The sharp, searing pain, and then blackness. A single piercing scream was torn from her throat, a sound of pure agony and confusion. She scrambled back away from Caleb, her eyes wide with a terror that was not for him, but for herself, for the woman she was, and the woman she had been. No, she sobbed, clutching her head. No, 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 he reached for her, his own tears streaming freely down his face. Lily, he choked out, using the name like a prayer. Lily, it's me. It's Caleb. You're home. His words were meant to be a comfort, but they were the final key that unlocked the door. The floodgates opened, and the life of Lillian Thorne came rushing back in a chaotic, overwhelming torrent. The memories didn't slot neatly into place. They collided with the life of Maria, creating a disorienting and painful fusion of two identities. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not just the broken man she had rescued, but her husband, the man she had promised her life to. She looked at the sleeping children and saw not just two orphans she had saved, but her own babies, her Samuel, her Rose. And then her gaze dropped to her own swollen, pregnant belly. The child, the nameless, fatherless child she had carried as a lonely stranger. A fresh wave of realization, more powerful than any before, struck her. She looked up at Caleb, her tear-filled eyes locking with his. The last piece of the puzzle fell into place with devastating clarity. This baby, she gasped, her hand flying to her stomach. It's yours. The revelation hung in the air, a sacred, stunning truth that rebuilt their world on a new and astonishing foundation. She was not Maria the rescuer. She was Lillian the wife, and mother returned from the dead. And she had been carrying their third child all along, a secret kept even from herself. The storm outside raged on, but inside the small cabin, the world had been reborn. The aftermath of the revelation was not a gentle dawn, but a blinding, disorienting sunrise. Lillian, she had to learn to think of herself as Lillian again, felt like a stranger in her own skin. The memories now unlocked were a turbulent sea. One moment she was Maria, her hands steady as she tended a wound. The next she was Lillian, overcome by a phantom scent of the bluebonnet fields of her Texas home. The last year of her life, the quiet solitude of Maria felt like a dream, while the life before it felt like a story, read from a book. Caleb was her anchor. He was patient, his love a steady, unwavering light in her confusion. He would sit with her for hours, filling in the gaps, telling her stories of their life together, reintroducing her to herself. He spoke of their courtship, the day he'd built her a porch swing, the way she'd always burned the biscuits. Each story was a breadcrumb, leading her back down the path to her own heart. The most profound connection was with the children. The first morning after the unveiling, Rose woke up and padded over to her. "Are you still Maria?" she asked, her small face serious. Lillian's heart broke and mended itself all in the same beat. She pulled the little girl into her lap, inhaling the sweet, familiar scent of her hair. "I am," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. "And I'm also your mama." Samuel stood back, watching his expression guarded. It was harder for him. He remembered his mother clearly, and this new version, with her different eyes and hesitant movements, was confusing. Lillian didn't push. She gave him space, her heart aching with a love so fierce it was a physical pain. She knew she had to earn back his trust, not as a rescuer, but as his mother. But their fragile internal world of rediscovery was not safe. The wanted poster was a constant looming threat. Bartholomew Finch was still out there. He was more than a villain in their past. He was a hunter, and they were his prey. Caleb knew Finch's arrogance. The man would not take the loss of his property and the humiliation of the rockslide lightly. He would be searching, and his reach was long. Their time was running out. Lillian's baby was due any day, and the thought of being on the run with a newborn was terrifying. They had to make a stand. The idea came to Lillian, a product of her two fused identities, Maria's knowledge of the terrain and Lillian's knowledge of Finch's character. "He won't expect us to stay," she said to Caleb one evening, her voice gaining a strength it hadn't had before. "He'll think we've run for the mountains, but he's an arrogant man. He'll want to see the place where he was beaten. He'll come back here himself to gloat or to find a trail." "It's too dangerous," Lily Caleb protested. "To wait for him, it's more dangerous to be caught in the open," she countered, her gaze firm. "Here we have the advantage. We know the land. You taught me to shoot Caleb. Remember, back in Texas, you said I was a natural." Another memory had surfaced, clear and sharp. The heft of a pistol, the kick against her palm. A plan began to form, born of desperation and a fierce will to protect their family. It was a plan that belonged to both Maria and Lillian. They used the remaining dynamite not for a rock slide, but for carefully laid traps on the main trail leading to the cabin. They created fallback positions in the rocks, stockpiling water and ammunition. They turned their sanctuary into a fortress. Samuel, seeing their preparations, finally came to Lillian. "Are the bad men coming back?" he asked, his small voice tight with fear. She knelt down to look him in the eye. "They might," she said honestly, "but this time, your papa and I are here together. We won't let them hurt you. Ever." She saw a flicker of the old trust in his eyes, and it fueled her resolve. They didn't have to wait long. A week later, as the sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the valley, Caleb spotted them from his lookout post. 3 riders, moving slowly, cautiously up the trail, and leading them, unmistakable, even at a distance, was the portly, imposing figure of Bartholomew Finch. The air grew still. The final act had begun. Lillian sent the children into the small root cellar beneath the cabin, a space she had reinforced and stocked with a blanket and a canteen. "Stay here until I come for you," she commanded, her voice calm, despite the frantic beating of her heart. "No matter what you hear. Do you understand?" They nodded, their faces pale, and she slid the heavy wooden door shut over them. She took her position in the rocks above the cabin, the Winchester feeling solid and familiar in her hands. Caleb was positioned across the canyon, creating a crossfire. They were outnumbered, but they had the element of surprise and the high ground. Finch and his men rode into the clearing in front of the cabin. They saw the repaired fence, the wisp of smoke from the chimney. They thought they had found their prey, sleeping. Thorn Finch's voice boomed slick with vile confidence. "I know you're in there. I have a poster that says I can take you dead or alive. I'm feeling partial to dead today. It saves on feed." He laughed, a guttural, ugly sound. One of his men dismounted and kicked open the cabin door, finding it empty. "He's run for the rocks," the man yelled. It was the signal. Caleb fired first. His shot was perfect, taking the hat clean off the head of the second henchman. The man yelped, diving for cover. Lillian sighted on Finch. She wasn't aiming for him, but for the ground at his horse's feet, just as she had done before. The shot kicked up a spray of dirt. Finch's horse reared screaming, and the man, for all his bluster, was a poor rider. He tumbled to the ground with an undignified grunt. Chaos erupted. The henchmen returned fire, their shots wild, splintering the rocks around Lillian's position. They were firing blind, unsure of where the shots were coming from. "It's an ambush," one yelled. "It's the woman," Finch roared, scrambling behind the well for cover. It has to be. Lillian and Caleb fired in a steady, coordinated rhythm, never exposing themselves for more than a second. They weren't trying to kill. They were trying to intimidate, to dismantle, to break their will. One of Caleb's shots struck a henchman in the arm, and the man cried out, dropping his rifle. But Finch was cunning. He realized they were being pinned. "Spread out," he bellowed. "Circle around. Find them." The remaining able-bodied man began to move, using the rocks for cover, trying to flank Caleb's position. This was the moment Lillian had feared. As the man scurried from one boulder to the next, he came into a clear line of sight. He was focused on Caleb's hiding spot, unaware of her presence above. She had a clean shot. Her finger tightened on the trigger. Killing him would be easy. But as she looked down the barrel, she didn't just see a threat. She saw a man, and the thought of taking a life, of spilling blood, warred with her instinct to protect. "Not like this." A voice inside her, the voice of Lillian, of Maria, whispered, "There has to be another way." Just then, a sharp, intense pain shot through her abdomen, stealing her breath. A contraction. The baby, it was coming. Now, panic threatened to overwhelm her, but she shoved it down with brutal force. She had to end this. She saw the henchman closing in on Caleb's position. She shifted her aim, not at the man, but at a precariously balanced rock formation just above him. Martha's husband had warned her about it, calling it the Widowmaker. She fired. The bullet struck the base of the formation with a sharp crack. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groan, the tons of rock shifted, hesitated, and came crashing down, creating a landslide that completely cut off the henchman's path, burying him not in stone, but in a torrent of dust and fear. He screamed, scrambling back, his nerve completely broken. "I'm out," he shrieked, running for his horse and fleeing the valley without a second thought. Now it was just Finch. He was trapped behind the well, a pistol in his hand, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. Another contraction, stronger this time, gripped Lillian. She gritted her teeth, tears of pain springing to her eyes. She had to get to the cabin. "Caleb," she screamed, her voice raw. "It's time." Caleb understood immediately. He laid down a volley of suppressing fire, giving her the cover she needed. Lillian scrambled down from the rocks, stumbling, half sobbing from the pain, and made it into the cabin, bolting the door behind her. The fight was now Caleb's alone. He moved from his position, circling around, closing in. Finch, seeing his chance, broke cover and ran for the cabin, hoping to take Lillian hostage. He kicked at the door, but it was solid oak. Suddenly, Caleb was there, stepping out from behind the corner of the building, his rifle leveled. "It's over, Finch." Finch spun around, his pistol raising. But he was too slow. Caleb wasn't a lawman. He was a husband and a father pushed to the edge. He fired. The shot struck Finch in the shoulder, spinning him around. The pistol flew from his grasp. He collapsed to the ground, howling in pain and fury. Caleb walked over and stood above him, his face a cold, hard mask. "This is for my family," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. He didn't kill him. Instead, he used a rope to bind Finch's hands and feet, leaving him trussed and helpless in the dirt he so coveted. He then raced into the cabin. He found Lillian on the bed, her face pale with sweat, her body racked with the pains of labor. The battle for their lives was over. The battle for a new life was just beginning. Through the pain, Lillian looked at her husband, her Caleb, and a fierce, triumphant love shone in her eyes. They had faced their ghost, and they had won. The desert night, once a canvas for Lillian's loneliness, was now filled with the raw, powerful sounds of life. Inside the cabin, the world had shrunk to the space between Lillian's pained breaths and the steady pressure of Caleb's hand in hers. He was her anchor, his hushed words of encouragement, a lifeline in the overwhelming sea of pain. In that crucible, the final vestiges of Maria, the solitary survivor, merged with Lillian, the wife and mother. She was both a woman forged whole in the fires of loss and reunion. Just as the first pale light of dawn touched the mesas, a new sound filled the air, the strong, indignant cry of a newborn. Exhausted and triumphant, Lillian wept with relief as Caleb placed their son on her chest. He was perfect, a symbol of their impossible new beginning. They named him Adam, a testament to the new life they had been granted. Later that morning, Caleb rode into Tres Piedras, dragging a bound and defeated Bartholomew Finch behind him. He delivered the slaver to the sheriff, and with the reward, money and the clearing of his name, the final shadow over their family was lifted. The story of the ghost woman who brought down Finch's operation became an instant local legend. When Caleb returned, he brought the town doctor who confirmed Lillian and baby Adam were healthy. "Remarkable," Dr. Blackwood mused, examining Lillian's eyes. "A traumatic hematoma. I've only read of such a thing altering eye color." "You're a medical marvel, Mrs. Thorne." But Lillian knew the true marvel was the resilience of a love that memory itself could not kill. The valley held too many ghosts, and they knew their future lay westward. They sold the cabin, and a month later, a sturdy wagon rolled toward the green promise of California. Caleb sat at the reins with Lillian beside him, cradling Adam. In the back, the laughter of Samuel and Rose was the only music they needed. As they crested a hill, Lillian looked back at the desert that had taken everything and then impossibly given it all back. Caleb reached over and took her hand, his touch a familiar comfort that spanned the lost year. "Are you happy, Lilly-bug?" he asked softly. She looked at her husband and her 3 children, her entire world contained within that single wagon. A radiant smile lit up her face, a dawn all its own. "More than you'll ever know," she said the words, an absolute, undeniable truth. That was the story of Lillian Thorne, a woman the West tried to erase, but whose love was too stubborn to die. It's a testament to the fact that even when we lose our way, when our own minds betray us, the heart remembers the path home. Lillian and Caleb's journey shows us that family isn't just about shared blood, but about the battles you fight for one another, and that the most profound discoveries are the ones we make about ourselves. If their incredible story of survival, loss, and impossible reunion moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a story of true resilience and the enduring power of love. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas from the annals of history that will capture your heart. Thank you for listening.